The first thing I noticed was my mother's voice. Even after all those years, I recognized it instantly through the wooden door. Soft, careful, almost nervous. "Please, we just want to talk." I stood in the hallway of my small house without moving. The clock above the kitchen sink ticked slowly. Outside, the evening sun stretched long shadows across the porch. I hadn't seen them in 8 years. 8 years since the day my father pointed at the door and said the words I still remember clearly. "If you walk out today, don't ever come back." And I did walk out, with one suitcase, with nowhere certain to go. Now the same people who called me a burden were standing outside my home, knocking again. And the strangest part wasn't the anger I expected to feel. It was the quiet question slowly forming in my mind. Why were they here now? Growing up in our house always felt like living beside someone more important. My brother Daniel was 2 years older than me. From the time we were children, it was clear he was the one my parents believed in. If he forgot his homework, the teacher was unreasonable. If he got into trouble, someone else must have started it. If I made a mistake, it meant something was wrong with me. At family dinners, my father would talk proudly about Daniel's future. "He's going to do great things," he would say. Then his eyes would drift toward me. "You just need to try harder." Try harder. Those words followed me through most of my childhood. I studied late at night, trying to earn the praise that never seemed to come. I helped around the house, cooked when my mother was tired, babysat neighbors' kids to save money. But somehow Daniel's smallest achievement always filled the room louder than anything I did. Have you ever grown up feeling like you were living in someone else's shadow? At first, I told myself things would change when we became adults. Maybe once we both built our own lives, my parents would finally see me differently. But the older we got, the pattern only grew stronger. The first real crack appeared when Daniel dropped out of college. He had been studying business for less than a year before calling home one afternoon saying it was too stressful. My parents rushed to support him immediately. My father drove 3 hours to pick him up. My mother cleared out the spare room. For weeks, they spoke about how brave he was for finding his own path. Meanwhile, I was working 2 part-time jobs while finishing my own degree. When I mentioned the stress I was under, my mother shrugged. "Everyone has responsibilities," she said. The difference was obvious. Daniel's struggles were treated like important life events. Mine were simply expected. Looking back now, that was the moment something inside me began to change. Not anger, just awareness. Because once you start noticing a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. Still, I stayed. Still, I tried to be the daughter they wanted. But the day would come when trying wasn't enough anymore. The final argument started over something small. It was a Sunday evening. Daniel had borrowed money again. Not a little. Enough that my parents had taken money from their savings to cover it. When I quietly asked whether this was the 3rd time that year, my father slammed his hand on the table. "Stop judging your brother." "I'm not judging him," I said carefully. "I'm just asking why it keeps happening." My mother shook her head, as if I had said something offensive. "You always make things difficult." Difficult? The word hung in the air like a verdict. Daniel sat silently beside them, avoiding my eyes. Have you ever realized that sometimes people defend the person causing the problem, simply because admitting the truth would be uncomfortable? That night, the argument grew louder than any we had ever had before, and eventually my father said the sentence that changed everything. "If living here is so hard for you, then leave." For a moment, I thought he didn't mean it, but his face stayed cold, so I packed my suitcase and I walked out the door. The first few years after leaving were harder than I ever expected. When I closed the door behind me that night, I didn't have a plan. I only had one suitcase and a phone with a few numbers saved in it. I remember standing at the bus stop with my bag beside my feet, watching cars pass in the dark. The streetlights hummed softly above me. For the first time in my life, there was no one telling me what to do next. Freedom can feel a lot like fear when you first meet it. A friend from college let me sleep on her couch for a while. Her apartment was small, barely enough space for 2 people, but she never complained. Every morning, I folded the blanket carefully and moved it to the corner before she woke up. During the day, I worked long shifts at a cafe near the train station. The smell of coffee clung to my clothes. My hands always smelled faintly like sugar and milk. Customers came and went without ever knowing how carefully I counted every tip. At night after the cafe closed, I studied. My textbooks were often open on the small kitchen table while my friend slept in the next room. Some nights my eyes burned from exhaustion, but I kept going. Because for the first time, The effort I was making belonged only to me. No comparisons, no one measuring me against my brother, just quiet progress. Have you ever realized how powerful small steps become when no one is standing there telling you that you'll fail? Slowly, things began to change. The couch turned into a shared apartment. The part-time cafe job turned into a stable office position. The constant anxiety I carried for years began fading little by little. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still bills, still long days at work, still moments when loneliness showed up late at night when the house was quiet. But something important had shifted. The version of myself who used to beg for approval had disappeared somewhere along the way. Instead, I began learning how to trust my own decisions. On weekends, I would walk through the park near my apartment. Sometimes I sat on the same wooden bench for an hour just thinking about how different life felt. Not easier, just calmer. There was no tension in the air, no careful monitoring of my words, no fear that something I said might start another argument. Years passed faster than I expected. I finished my degree, saved enough money for a down payment, and eventually bought the small house I now lived in. It wasn't large, but every corner of it belonged to choices I had made for myself. The garden out front, the quiet kitchen, the sunlight that filled the living room in the morning. It was the first place that ever truly felt like mine. And during all those years, my parents never called. Not once. At first I wondered why. Later, I stopped asking. Because sometimes silence answers a question more clearly than words ever could. And by the time the years had fully settled into place, I had finally built something I never thought I would have. A life that didn't depend on their acceptance. About 5 years after I left, something unexpected happened. My phone rang late one evening while I was finishing dinner. The number on the screen looked familiar, but it took me a second to recognize it. Daniel. For a moment, I just stared at the phone. We hadn't spoken since the night I walked out of our parents' house. Years had passed without a single message or call. Curiosity finally made me answer. His voice sounded different, less confident than I remembered. "Hey, it's me," he said. "I know," I replied quietly. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Mom and Dad are having some financial problems." I didn't say anything. I just listened. Apparently, Daniel had started a business with money our parents helped him invest. At first it looked promising, at least that's what he told them. But things had changed, clients disappeared, loans grew larger, payments started piling up. And somewhere along the way, most of my parents' savings had been used to keep his business alive. "Things are tight right now," Daniel continued. Another pause, then he added something that made the meaning of the call completely clear. "You're doing well these days, right?" It wasn't really a question, more like a careful way of leading the conversation somewhere. For a moment, I remembered the old version of myself, the one who would immediately start looking for a way to fix things, the daughter who always tried to keep peace in the family. But that version of me had slowly disappeared over the years. Instead, I simply asked one quiet question. "Why are you calling me about this?" Daniel hesitated. "Well, your family." Family. The word sounded strange after so many years of silence. Have you ever noticed how quickly people remember that word when they need something? I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet stretch between us. Finally, I said something simple. "I hope things work out for you." He waited, probably expecting something more, an offer, a promise. But none came. After a moment, the conversation ended politely. And when I set my phone down, I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I had chosen not to carry a problem that was never mine to begin with. After that call, life returned to its quiet rhythm. Days passed the way they usually did. Work in the morning, small routines in the evening, and weekends spent taking care of the house I had built piece by piece over the years. For a while, I expected another call, maybe from my mother, maybe from my father. But none came. And slowly, the memory of that conversation with Daniel faded into the background, like so many other things from the past. Have you ever noticed how some chapters of life simply close without ceremony? Another 3 years passed. During that time, my life continued growing in ways that once seemed impossible. I earned a promotion at work, my savings increased, I even started planting a small garden in the front yard, something I had always wanted but never had space for before. It wasn't a dramatic life, just peaceful. And peace, I learned, can be more valuable than anything else. Most evenings, I sat on the front porch for a few minutes before going inside. The street was quiet, lined with trees that changed colors with the seasons. Sometimes I watched neighbors walking their dogs or children riding bikes down the sidewalk. Moments like that made me realize how far I had come from the girl who once stood at a bus stop with one suitcase and nowhere certain to go. The anger I once carried toward my parents had slowly disappeared. Not because they apologized, because time had given me distance, and distance has a strange way of softening old wounds. I rarely thought about them anymore. They had their lives. I had mine. So when I heard a knock on the door that evening, I assumed it was a neighbor or a delivery driver. But when I looked through the small window beside the door, my breath caught for just a second. My parents were standing on the porch, older, tired, and suddenly very real again after years of silence. For a long moment, I didn't move. The past was standing right outside my house, knocking. For a few seconds, I just stood there. My hand rested on the doorknob, but I didn't turn it yet. Through the small glass panel beside the door, I could see my parents clearly. My mother looked smaller than I remembered. Her shoulders curved slightly forward, and her hands were clasped tightly together. My father stood beside her, staring down at the porch floor as if studying the wooden boards. They both looked older. Not just older in years. Older in the way people look after life has quietly worn them down. I opened the door. The evening air slipped into the hallway, cool and calm. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my mother took a careful step forward. "We weren't sure if you would open the door," she said softly. Her voice sounded fragile, almost unfamiliar. I studied their faces. Years ago, I had imagined this moment many different ways, sometimes in anger, sometimes with questions, sometimes with the hope that one day they would apologize. But standing there now, I felt something different. Just calm. My father finally lifted his eyes. "We need help," he said. The words were simple, no explanation, no apology. Just the same quiet request Daniel had hinted at years earlier. In that moment, the entire story made sense. The silence, the sudden visit, the nervous knock on the door. They hadn't come because they missed me. They came because they needed something. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then I stepped slightly aside and gestured toward the porch chairs. "You can sit for a minute," I said calmly. They sat down slowly. My mother looked around the yard, noticing the garden and the small house behind me. "You've done well for yourself," she said. I nodded. It took time. Another silence settled between us. Finally, my father spoke again. "Your brother's situation got worse," he admitted. "We lost most of our savings." There it was. The truth they had driven across the country to deliver. They needed help. I listened quietly until he finished speaking. Then I said something they probably didn't expect. "I'm glad you came to tell me." My mother looked relieved for a moment, but then I continued. "I hope things improve for you." My father frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I held his gaze calmly. "I mean, I can't solve this for you." The porch went quiet again. Not angry, just heavy with understanding. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do in life isn't proving your worth to the people who once doubted you. Sometimes it's simply protecting the life you worked so hard to build. After a moment, my parents slowly stood up. My mother nodded once before turning toward the driveway. They walked away quietly. And as the evening light faded across the garden, I closed the door gently. Not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, but out of something much stronger. Peace. What would you have done in that moment? Comment below.